There is a version of Napoleon Bonaparte that history loves to tell: the general, the emperor, the man who stood at the center of Europe and bent it to his will, the man who marched armies across mountains and deserts and frozen plains and came back again and again with victories that seemed to defy the limits of what any single human mind could accomplish. That version of Napoleon is real. Every battle, every campaign, every crushing defeat of every coalition that Europe assembled against him, it all happened, and it was extraordinary. But there is another version. Smaller, private, written in ink on paper, sent across hundreds of miles to a woman who, at least in the beginning, could not bring herself to open the envelopes. That version of Napoleon is the one history tends to leave out, because it is harder to make sense of, because it does not fit easily beside Austerlitz and Waterloo and the Napoleonic Code and the image of a man in a bicorn hat standing with one hand tucked into his coat, surveying the horizon with cold certainty. The man who wrote those letters was not cold. He was not certain. He was in the privacy of his own longing, something much closer to desperate. And what Josephine did with those letters, and what Napoleon did when he finally understood what she had done, tells a story about power and love and the particular kind of wound that not even an emperor can heal. This is that story. Her name was Marie-Joseph Rose Tascher de la Pagerie, though almost no one called her that. She had been born in Martinique in 1763, the daughter of a sugar plantation family that had seen better years. She had come to France as a young woman, married a French officer named Alexandre de Beauharnais, survived the revolution, barely, and at tremendous cost, and emerged on the other side of the terror as a widow with 2 children, considerable charm, and very little money. She was 32 years old when she met Napoleon Bonaparte. He was 26. She moved through Parisian society with a particular kind of ease that he had never had and suspected he never would. She was graceful in a way that came from years of learning exactly how rooms worked, how people needed to be made to feel, how to be present in a social space without ever seeming to try. She wore her hair in the soft, loose style that was fashionable in those post-revolutionary years. She had a low, quiet voice. She knew when to say very little. Napoleon was not like that. He was intense in a way that made some people uncomfortable. He talked about ideas with a directness that bypassed small talk entirely. He had spent his adult life in military camps, in strategy sessions, in the hard masculine world of campaigns and supply chains, and the logistics of moving 30,000 men across terrain that was actively trying to kill them. He was brilliant, and he was awkward, and he was burning with an ambition that had not yet found its full shape. When he met Josephine, something happened to him that had not happened before. He could not quite account for it. He could not strategize around it. He could not read the terrain and identify the path to victory. She was not interested in his ambition. She was not frightened of his intensity. She looked at him with a kind of amused, measuring attention that made him feel, simultaneously, completely seen and completely off balance. He fell in love with her immediately and completely in the way that certain people fall in love. Not gradually, not cautiously, but all at once, like a structure collapsing inward. She was not sure how she felt about him. This is the part of the story that gets lost when people talk about Napoleon and Josephine. They are talked about as one of history's great love stories, a romantic pairing, the emperor and his empress. What that framing obscures is how unequal the love was at the beginning, how much he wanted her, and how uncertain she was. How clearly she could see that he was remarkable, and how little that clarity translated into the particular feeling he needed her to have. She had loved before. She had been married before, and that marriage had ended in the shadow of the guillotine, and the years of the revolution had left their mark on her in ways she did not always discuss. She was practical about love in a way that Napoleon, despite all his strategic brilliance, was not. She understood that love and need were different things, and she was not entirely sure which of those things Napoleon was feeling, or which of them she was capable of returning. They married in March 1796. It was a civil ceremony, brief and businesslike, attended by almost no one. Napoleon was so impatient to be done with the formalities that he apparently gave a false age on the marriage documents, reducing the gap between them. 2 days after the wedding, he left for Italy. And the letters began. The Italian campaign of 1796 is one of the most celebrated military achievements in European history. Napoleon took a demoralized, underfed French army and transformed it, through a combination of speed and tactical brilliance, into a conquering force that swept through northern Italy and forced the Austrian Empire to negotiate. It was the campaign that made him a national hero, that began the transformation of a promising young general into something approaching a legend. He conducted it, in large part, while writing letters to Josephine that bordered on fever. He wrote to her constantly, from camps, from billets, from whatever shelter was available after the day's march. He wrote in the brief windows between planning sessions and troop reviews and the logistics of keeping an army fed and moving. He wrote when he was exhausted and when he was exhilarated and when the fighting had been heavy and when it had been light. The letters were long, urgent, tender, sometimes almost incoherent in their longing. He told her that he thought of her constantly, that the thought of her was the thing he carried with him through every difficulty. He described missing her with a physical specificity that was unusual for a man of his era and his background. Not the formal, stylized sentiments of conventional romantic correspondence, but something raw and more direct. He asked her to write back. He begged her to write back. He counted the days between her letters when they came, and the letters did not always come when he expected them. Because Josephine was not writing back very often, and when she did write, the letters were brief, polite, and maintained a careful emotional distance that Napoleon could feel across every mile of road between them. She was in Paris. She was in society. She was attending dinners and entertainments and moving through the world of the capital with the ease that was natural to her. She was not, as Napoleon's letters made clear he desperately wished, sitting alone thinking about him. There were other complications, darker ones, that the historical record touches on with careful restraint. There were people in Josephine's life during the Italian campaign whose presence Napoleon was, at some point, made aware of. The details are disputed, and the full truth of that period is difficult to establish with certainty. What is not disputed is that Napoleon knew his wife was not spending the months of his absence in quiet devotion, and that this knowledge was one of the great private agonies of a man who was, publicly, becoming unstoppable. He kept writing the letters. There is something almost unbearable about that. The image of the man who had just broken the back of the Austrian Empire, who was being celebrated throughout France as a military genius, sitting in the failing light of an Italian evening and writing page after page to a woman who had not responded to the last 3 letters he had sent her. He knew what the silence probably meant. He was not a stupid man. He was one of the most analytically gifted minds of his generation. He knew how to read a situation. But he kept writing. What does it mean that he kept writing? It means, perhaps, that there are situations in which intelligence is not the relevant tool. That there are forms of need which do not respond to analysis. That Napoleon Bonaparte, who had learned to impose his will on the world with extraordinary success, had encountered something he could not impose his will upon, and that this fact did not make him stop wanting it. It made him want it more. Josephine eventually joined him in Italy after the campaign was largely concluded. Those who observed them together in those months describe a Napoleon who was visibly different in her presence. More relaxed, less guarded, with the particular quality of ease that comes to people when the thing they have been anxious about is finally physically there. He was happy in a way that his aides and officers found somewhat startling. The controlled intensity that he brought to everything else seemed to soften. Josephine was warm toward him. She could be charming, affectionate, attentive. She was not indifferent to him. But the people who observed her closely in those years noted something that Napoleon in his happiness may not have fully seen, that her warmth was genuine without being consuming. That she cared for him without being anchored to him in the way he was anchored to her. That for her, love was one of many things that made life livable. While for him, love for her had become something closer to a center of gravity. The Egyptian campaign of 1798 separated them again, this time more dramatically. Napoleon sailed for Egypt with an army and a fleet, intending to strike at British interests and extend French power into the eastern Mediterranean. It was an extraordinarily ambitious undertaking, conceived and executed with characteristic boldness, and it ended with characteristic complexity. Brilliant tactical successes, strategic difficulties, and the eventual destruction of the French fleet by the British Admiral Nelson at the Battle of the Nile. He wrote to Josephine from Egypt. The letters from this campaign have a different quality from the Italian ones. They are still urgent, still full of longing, but there is something else in them. A note of pain that goes beyond simple longing, a sharpness that suggests Napoleon had received information, or confirmed suspicions, that cut deeper than distance alone could account for. In one letter, written in the summer of 1798, he told her that she was the only thing that could make him feel anything in a world that had otherwise become a kind of machinery to him. In another, he asked her, with a directness that must have cost him something to put on paper, whether she truly loved him at all, or whether she had simply accepted a situation that was, on its practical terms, advantageous to her. He did not send that letter. It was found among his papers years later, unsent, folded, and placed with the letters that had been sent. He had written it and then put it aside and written a different one. The question, once written, could not be unwritten. It was there, in his own handwriting, the thing he could not bring himself to ask aloud and could not stop himself from asking in private. Whether she loved him. whether any of it was real. When Napoleon returned from Egypt in 1799, the political situation in France had deteriorated significantly, and within months he had orchestrated the coup that made him first consul and effectively the ruler of France. The speed of that transformation, from returning general to head of state, is one of the most remarkable sequences in modern political history. He moved with the decisiveness and clarity that characterized everything he did in the public world. In his private world, things were more complicated. He and Josephine had a confrontation upon his return that was by all accounts significant. The details vary between sources. What is consistent across the accounts is that Napoleon arrived back in France with a grievance he had been carrying across hundreds of miles of sea and desert, and that the confrontation between them was serious enough that divorce was considered, or at least threatened, before something shifted and they remained together. What shifted is not entirely clear. Some accounts suggest it was Josephine's distress that moved him. Some suggest it was his own inability to follow through on a separation he could not actually want. Some suggest it was a combination, that she wept and that his heart, which was impervious to cannon fire, was not impervious to that. They reconciled. He became emperor, she became empress, and the paradox at the center of their relationship. His consuming need for her genuine but less consuming affection for him, continued to define the private life of the most powerful man in Europe. He still wrote to her when campaigns took him away. The letters from the later years are different from the early ones. More controlled, the longing present but held at a greater distance, the raw urgency of the Italian letters replaced with something more measured. He had learned something, in the years between, about the cost of sending everything he felt across the distance. He had learned to hold some of it back. But those who read the later letters carefully note that holding it back was not the same as not feeling it. The restraint was a form of pain too. The pain of a man who had learned to protect himself from his own heart's most direct expression, because the direct expression had not been received in the way he needed it to be. Josephine, for her part, grew into her role as empress with considerable grace and political skill. She was genuinely beloved by the French public in a way that reflected real qualities. She was warm, she was accessible, she had an instinctive understanding of how to represent something larger than herself without losing the personal quality that made people trust her. She and Napoleon functioned, in the public sphere, as genuine partners. And she did love him. That is important to say clearly because the story of their relationship is sometimes told in a way that reduces her to a figure of calculation or indifference. She loved him, but she loved him in the way she was capable of loving, which was not the way he needed to be loved. She could not give him the center of gravity feeling he gave her, the sense that everything else in the world was peripheral. She could give him warmth, partnership, genuine care, and the particular form of belonging that comes from choosing to stay. For most people, that would be enough. For Napoleon, it was not quite enough and also more than he could bear to be without. The divorce came in 1809. It was political in its necessity. Napoleon needed an heir, Josephine had not produced one, and the dynastic logic of empire made a different marriage increasingly inescapable. The decision was Napoleon's, and it was the right strategic choice by every calculation that mattered to the stability of what he had built. He wept at the ceremony. Those who were present describe a Napoleon who was in those moments not an emperor at all. Just a man sitting in a formal room, doing a formal thing that was costing him something he would not be able to replace. She wept too. He married Marie-Louise of Austria the following year. She was young, politically appropriate, and she gave him the son he needed. The marriage was not unhappy. Marie-Louise was a capable and dignified empress. Napoleon treated her with consideration and seemed content in the domestic sense of the word. He kept writing to Josephine, not with the frequency of the early years, not with the urgency of the Italian campaign letters, but steadily. He sent her news. He asked after her health. He told her about his son, the King of Rome, with a tenderness that suggested he wished she could have been the one to give him that child. The letters had the quality of something that could not be fully ended, a conversation that had no natural stopping point, because the feeling that had generated it had no natural stopping point. She died in May 1814, just weeks after Napoleon's first abdication at the age of 50. She had contracted a chill and declined quickly. Napoleon was on Elba by the time word reached him. He shut himself in his room and did not come out for 2 days. Those 2 days were not spoken of very much in the accounts that followed. Napoleon's attendants on Elba noted them, described the closed door, described asking if he needed anything and receiving no response. They did not elaborate on what those hours contained because they could not know. Only Napoleon knew what happened in that room in those 2 days, what he thought about, what he understood or failed to understand or understood too late. When he came back out, he was himself again, or the version of himself he presented to the world. controlled, decisive, already beginning to think about what came next. His last reported words, spoken on Saint Helena years later, in the final days of his life, are disputed in their exact phrasing. But multiple accounts record him saying her name near the end, Josephine. Whether it was a final word or simply a word spoken in the disorientation of his last hours cannot be determined. What can be said is that he had spent 30 years moving at a speed that the world struggled to keep up with. 30 years of campaigns and strategies and political constructions of extraordinary complexity. And in the end, in the diminished space of Saint Helena, the thing that surfaced was not Austerlitz. It was not the Napoleonic Code. It was not the image of himself standing at the center of Europe with everything bent to his will. It was her name. The letters she did not always open. The letters he kept writing anyway. The question he wrote and did not send, folded and placed with the letters that had been sent, found among his papers afterward, whether she truly loved him at all. He never got an answer to that question. Or perhaps he did, and the answer was the one that the letters had always suggested. That she loved him, yes, but not in the way he loved her, and that this asymmetry was the one thing in his extraordinary life he could not reorganize or outmaneuver or simply outrun. Some conquests are never completed. Some distances remain, no matter how many miles are closed. Napoleon Bonaparte moved armies across continents. He rewrote the legal codes of nations. He remade the map of Europe twice. And the thing that undid him in the end was not the Allied armies at Waterloo, not the winter of Russia, not the island of Saint Helena and the slow diminishment of exile. It was a woman who sometimes did not open his letters. And the fact that he kept writing them anyway. That is the story history leaves out. Not because it makes him less, because it makes him more. Because it reveals the thing that all the victories, and all the campaigns, and all the marble busts, and all the history books cannot quite contain. That behind the legend there was a person, and the person was in love, and the love was not returned in the measure it was given, and he lived with that his entire life and died with her name on his lips. The letters are in the archives. Some of them have been published. Some of them have not. They sit in their cases, handwritten on paper that has aged to the color of old ivory, the ink faded but still legible. They begin, many of them, the same way. With her name. With the French word for I, the possessive that insists on connection. With the urgency of a man who could not stop reaching across the distance, even when the distance did not reach back. He already knew she might not be waiting. He wrote to her anyway. That is perhaps the most human thing about Napoleon Bonaparte. Not the genius. Not the ambition. The letters.